The trail below the saddle is barely wide enough for one stretcher at a time, and 11 wounded men are being carried down it in the grey light after the mountain came alive with gunfire from 3 sides at once. Behind them, on the high ground they are leaving, First Lieutenant Sam Corliss turns to the one soldier still standing at the mouth of the pass and says the sentence that will follow him for the rest of his career: "A woman can't hold that pass." Corporal Rhea Calloway doesn't answer him with words. She checks the mount on her weapon, counts the magazines lined along her chest rig with 2 fingers the way she has counted them 1,000 times before, and walks toward the saddle alone, while the rest of the platoon disappears down the switchbacks with their wounded, leaving her the only living thing between the enemy. Nobody in 3rd Platoon Anvil Company thought of Rhea Calloway as anything more than the corporal who carried the extra radio battery and knew, with irritating precision, exactly how many minutes of daylight were left at any given moment on any given ridge. She had been passed over for the non-commissioned officer's advanced course twice, quietly, without explanation, the kind of paperwork failure that nobody apologizes for and nobody reverses. She was the one Sergeant Frost put on the radios when the platoon needed a steady hand, and nobody wanted to say out loud that steady hand belonged to someone they didn't fully trust with a rifle in a fight. She answered to Cal when anyone bothered to shorten her name at all, moved through the platoon's daily grind with a kind of contained, watchful quiet that most of the younger soldiers mistook for shyness, and carried, folded into a back pocket of memory, nobody in this platoon had clearance to open. Before Anvil Company, before the transfer that nobody questioned, because nobody was allowed to ask, Rhea Calloway had held ground alone once already on a deployment that existed in exactly one place, a sealed after-action report with a classification marking that made most captains' eyes widen and their mouths close. It was not a story she told. It was not a story she was permitted to tell. So when Lieutenant Corliss looked at the corporal holding the radios and saw a woman who had never done anything harder than reading a map grid off a printed sheet, he was not being cruel by his own accounting. He was simply repeating the only version of her he had ever been shown, because the version that mattered had never been declassified for him to see. It began 4 hours before dawn, the way most disasters in that country began, quietly, with nothing on the radio but static and the ordinary chatter of a platoon moving through terrain that had looked on the map at battalion like a straightforward movement to a resupply point 11 kilometers north. 3rd Platoon had come up a river valley overnight, 26 soldiers strong, moving in staggered file beneath a ridgeline the mission brief had rated as unlikely enemy presence, a phrase that combat veterans had long ago learned to translate as nobody has actually looked. The first indication that the brief was wrong came at 0512, when a burst of automatic fire raked the lead squad from a rock shelf 200 meters up the northern slope, and within 90 seconds 3 more firing positions opened up along both flanks of the valley, catching the platoon in what any infantry manual would call a textbook L-shaped ambush, and what the soldiers living through it simply called the worst morning of their lives. Staff Sergeant Abel Frost, the platoon sergeant, got them moving before most of them had even identified where the fire was coming from. An instinct built over 3 deployments, the kind of reflex that doesn't wait for permission. He screamed the platoon into the only cover the terrain offered, a shallow wash along the river's edge, and began the brutal, unglamorous work of accounting for casualties, while First Lieutenant Corliss, 6 months into his first platoon command, and still learning the difference between what looks right on a map and what is actually survivable on the ground, tried to raise battalion on a radio that kept dropping to static every time the valley walls swallowed the signal. By the time the platoon fought its way to a covered rally point at the base of the ridge, they had 4 wounded who could still walk with help, 3 who could not walk at all, and Doc Emery Tran working over all 7 of them with the calm, economical hands of a medic who has learned not to let his face show The map showed exactly one way out. That didn't mean walking straight back into the ambush's kill zone. A narrow trail switchbacking down through a gorge to the south, the only route wide enough to move litters, funneling eventually to a resupply road where a relief column could reach them if, and it was a large, if someone could buy the platoon enough time to get there. And above that trail, commanding every meter of it from higher ground, sat a saddle pass between two peaks, the single piece of terrain in the entire valley that could let the enemy either pour fire down onto the descending column or simply walk around and cut it off before it ever reached the road. Frost put it to Corliss in language that didn't leave room for softening. If nobody held that saddle, the platoon would be exposed on the switchbacks for the better part of an hour, with 11 wounded on litters. And the enemy that had already proven it knew this terrain intimately would use the high ground to finish what the ambush had started. Corliss understood the tactical logic instantly. He had, whatever else could be said about him, actually studied his doctrine. But understanding a plan and volunteering to be the plan are very different kinds of courage. It was Calloway who broke the silence, because she had already done the math the way she always did the math, quietly, in the part of her mind that never fully stopped running numbers even when the rest of her was exhausted and scraped and covered in the same grey dust as everyone else. Battalion had confirmed a relief column was inbound from the forward operating base, but the terrain between here and there meant the column's realistic arrival window was somewhere between 8 and 10 hours out, not the optimistic 90 minutes that had been floated over the radio in the first panicked minutes of contact. The platoon could not carry 11 wounded down a single-file gorge trail in under an hour, if they were also fighting off an enemy holding the high ground above them. Someone had to occupy that saddle, had to make the enemy believe it was still defended by more than a skeleton crew, and had to hold it. Not for 90 minutes, but for however long it actually took the column to arrive, which the math said could be 9 hours or more. "I'll hold it," she said. And it came out flat and certain, the same tone she used to report a radio frequency or a grid coordinate. No drama in it at all. Corliss's answer was immediate, and it was the sentence that would define the rest of the day. "A woman can't hold that pass," he said, not shouting, almost reasonable in his delivery. The tone of a man stating something he genuinely believed was simple fact rather than insult. She was, in his accounting, a radio operator with decent marksmanship scores and no combat leadership record anyone in this platoon had ever seen. And the saddle needed a rifleman or better, a small element, not a single corporal, with a chest rig and a grudge. Frost, who had served with Calloway longer than Corliss had been in uniform, and had learned to read the particular stillness that came over her before she did something extraordinary, said nothing at all, which, from Frost, was its own kind of vote. "With respect, sir, there isn't a squad to spare, and there isn't time to argue about who's allowed to be brave today," Calloway said, and she was already moving toward the saddle before Corliss found the words to order her not to. He did try. He opened his mouth to make it a command rather than a request, but Frost caught his arm and shook his head. Once a small motion that said more clearly than any regulation could that some decisions, once a soldier has already started walking. Corliss let his hand drop. 9 hours, the platoon believed. 9 hours until the relief column's lead vehicles could reasonably reach the base of that gorge. 9 hours for one corporal to convince an enemy force of unknown size that the saddle above them was still worth more caution than a single lightly armed woman actually represented. She moved fast up the last 100 meters to the saddle, using the dead ground, the way the terrain offered it, and reached the crest with her lungs burning and her mind already working through the only real weapon she had that morning that wasn't ammunition, the ground itself. The saddle was a natural notch between two rocky shoulders, maybe 40 meters across at its narrowest point, flanked on both sides by boulder fields that channeled any approach into two predictable lanes, a wide, easier lane on the eastern shoulder that any competent enemy commander would favor, Mars's exposed lane to the west that offered speed at the cost of cover. Behind her, the ground fell away toward a scattering of collapsed stone terraces, remnants of some abandoned agricultural use from decades before the war that had brought 3rd Platoon to this valley. And those terraces gave her something precious, 3 separate elevated firing positions, none visible from the other, each one able to cover both approach lanes if she moved between them fast enough and quiet enough. She took inventory the way she had been trained to take inventory a long time ago, in a life she wasn't allowed to describe to anyone in this platoon. 8 magazines for her rifle, 240 rounds, plus the 80 additional rounds Frost had stripped from 2 of the wounded soldiers' kits before sending her up, soldiers who would not need them where they were headed, and who had insisted, both of them without being asked twice. 2 fragmentation grenades, 1 smoke canister, a single flare, a radio with a battery she estimated, at conservative transmit discipline, could last most of the day if she kept her calls short. No claymores, no belt-fed weapon, no second set of eyes to watch her back while she slept, because she was not going to sleep. Not for 9 hours, not with a battle happening on the ground beneath her. 240 rounds sounds like a great deal of ammunition, until it is divided against 9 hours and an enemy force of unknown size. And Calloway did that division standing at the crest of the saddle, with the wind cutting sideways through the notch, carrying the sound of scattered gunfire still echoing up from the valley floor below. 26 rounds an hour, roughly, if she wanted a margin for the worst hour rather than the average one. And that number, thin as it was, told her everything about how this day had to be fought. She was not going to hold this pass by out shooting anyone. She was going to hold it by making one corporal look, from a distance and through dust and confusion, like an entrenched squad that any sane attacker would rather probe than charge. The first hour passed in a silence so complete that Calloway found herself doubting the enemy had followed at all. Until, at what her watch told her was 51 minutes past the platoon's departure, she caught movement along the tree line at the base of the eastern approach lane, 3 figures, testing way of a reconnaissance element rather than an assault, clearly sent forward to learn what, if anything, still defended this ground. She let them close to just past 300 meters before she fired a single round, deliberately placed to land, short and kick rock fragments into the air, near their position, rather than aim to kill at a range. The 3 figures dropped instantly and scrambled back into the tree line, and Calloway allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of stillness before she was moving, low and fast along the covered route behind the terraces, to her second firing position on the western shoulder. From there, she fired a second round, spaced almost 2 minutes after the first, at a completely different angle relative to where the probe had last seen fire originate, a detail that to an enemy scout, watching the ridge, would read as 2 separate shooters covering 2 separate sectors rather than 1 soldier working an old irrigation terrace like a stage. It was a trick as old as warfare itself, dressed up in modern rifles and modern optics, and it depended entirely on discipline. Never fire twice from the same position. Never let the rhythm of her shots suggest a single exhausted shooter working alone. Always leave the enemy slightly more uncertain after contact than before it. The reconnaissance element withdrew fully within the first hour, and Calloway used the lull that followed to move a spare uniform jacket and helmet she'd carried up from a wounded soldier's discarded kit into a decoy position at her first firing point, propped at an angle that would read, through binoculars at 400 meters, as a second defender crouched behind the stone wall. By the second hour, the light had changed from the flat gray of early morning to a harder, whiter sun climbing over the eastern ridge. And Calloway used the improved visibility against herself as much as it helped her, because now the enemy could see the saddle more clearly too, which meant her decoys needed to be better, not fewer. She built a second dummy position on the western shoulder, using a poncho stretched over broken branches and weighted with rocks roughly the silhouette of a prone rifleman from a distance, and she deliberately left a scrap of her own uniform's drab green fabric snagged on a branch near the eastern boulder field. Human detail that a cautious enemy element reads as evidence of careless defenders rather than a trap, because nobody sets a trap by accident, and accidents are what soldiers trust. She checked in with the platoon on a tight 30-second transmission window, keeping her voice level and unhurried. The way she had learned mattered more than any words she actually said. Panic in a voice on a radio spreads faster than any enemy fire, and she was not going to be the reason. 11 wounded men on litters lost confidence in the ground behind them. Frost's voice came back steady, confirming they'd made it past the first switchback with the litters intact, and Doctran's flat, focused updates on vitals threading in and out of the channel like a second heartbeat for the whole operation. Corliss said nothing on that check-in. Calloway noted it and moved on, because there wasn't time that morning to spend on a lieutenant's silence, only on the 7 hours still standing between the platoon and the road. The second probe came at the 90-minute mark, larger than the first, 6 fighters this time, splitting into 2 elements to test both approach lanes simultaneously. A more serious tactical decision that told Calloway the enemy commander below had upgraded his assessment of what he was facing, even if he still hadn't guessed how thin that assessment actually was. She met the eastern element with 2 rounds, fired 11 seconds apart from her elevated terrace position, dropping one fighter's forward momentum hard enough that the element pulled back to cover, and she met the western element with a single, harder shot at 220 meters that struck the boulder beside the lead fighter and sent rock splinters across his position, driving all 3 of them flat and then backward. No kills, she could confirm from that distance. And she did not need kills. She needed doubt, and doubt was exactly what 6 fighters carried back down the slope with them when they withdrew a second time. By the 3rd hour, the sun sat high enough that the saddle had become an oven of pale rock and reflected heat, and Calloway rationed her water with the same cold arithmetic she'd applied to her ammunition. She had 2 canteens, and 9 hours in that heat, while moving constantly between 3 firing positions, was going to cost her more fluid than 2 canteens comfortably covered. So she allowed herself small, timed sips rather than the deep pulls her body wanted. She used the quiet stretch of the 3rd hour to improve her fighting positions further, stacking loose stone into low parapets at each of her 3 terrace points, widening her sight lines with a folding entrenching tool she'd carried up specifically for that purpose. Every piece of dead ground the enemy might use to close distance without exposing themselves. It was during this quiet stretch that her mind, unbidden, returned to the deployment she wasn't permitted to discuss. 3 years earlier, a different mountain range, on a different continent, a different choke point that had needed holding, while a small advisory element extracted personnel who could not otherwise have gotten out alive. She had written the after-action notes on that operation herself, in exhaustive, methodical detail, describing exactly the kind of terrain, discipline, and ammunition economy she was practicing again right now on this saddle. Decoy positions, staggered fire, false rhythm, the psychology of an enemy who cannot confirm. Those notes had gone into a report that was sealed the moment it was filed, not because anything shameful had happened, but because the operation itself and the reasons it had needed a single soldier holding ground for as long as she had held it that day. Nobody in 3rd Platoon knew that report existed. She was, in the truest sense, teaching herself nothing new on this mountain. She was simply doing, in daylight and for a platoon that doubted her, exactly what she had once done in silence for people who never got the chance to thank her by name. At the 2-hour 40-minute mark, she caught a glint of glass on the eastern ridge, high above the approach lanes, an observer with binoculars or a scope, watching from a position she couldn't reach, with accurate fire at that range, confirming her suspicion that whatever force she was facing had more organization behind it than a loose collection of ambush fighters. She logged the position mentally, adjusted her movement patterns to break line of sight to that observation point whenever she crossed between terraces, and kept working. 4 hours in, the platoon below had covered roughly half the gorge trail, moving at the grinding, careful pace that litters demand on switchback ground. Every step a negotiation between speed and the wounded men's ability to survive the jostling. Frost's radio updates had grown shorter, more clipped, the sound of a man conserving his own energy for the work still ahead rather than for conversation. But he never failed to check in on schedule, and every check-in included, without fail, a request for Calloway's status that she answered the same way each time. No change to the timeline. Corliss listened to those exchanges from beside the second litter team, his hand occasionally drifting to the radio handset as though he meant to say something and then didn't, and somewhere in that 4th hour, without ever announcing it to anyone around him, he had told her she couldn't hold that ground, and every 30-minute check-in was quietly, wordlessly proving him wrong, not through any speech or vindication moment, but through the simple accumulating fact of the platoon's continued survival. He didn't know yet what he was hearing in her voice, a controlled economy of movement and fire that sounded less like luck and more like a discipline he didn't have a name for. But he was starting to notice it the way a man notices a sound in the dark that doesn't match anything he expected to hear there. At the 4-hour mark, the enemy sent its first serious assault rather than a probe. 9 fighters moving in a coordinated rush up the western lane, while a supporting element opened suppressive fire from the tree line to pin whatever defenders held the saddle in place. Calloway had anticipated exactly this shape of attack. A probing force eventually tests a serious rush. Once it senses a position is thin, and she'd pre-staged for it, moving to her western terrace point with 2 magazines already seated, timing her first shots, not for the moment the rush began, but for the moment it reached the narrowest, most exposed section of the western lane, where the boulder field forced the fighters into single file for 11 meters. She fired 6 rounds in that stretch, spaced and deliberate, rather than rapid, dropping the lead, 2 fighters' momentum hard enough that the file behind them broke formation and scattered for cover. And she used the smoke canister for the first time, popping it into the gap between the lanes to blind the supporting element's line of sight, just long enough to relocate to her 3rd position before they could adjust their suppressive fire onto her actual location. The assault cost her the first real wound of the day, a graze along her forearm from a round that struck the stone parapet inches from her position and sent a fragment of rock into her sleeve, drawing a line of pain sharp enough to make her breath catch. She wrapped it in under a minute with a field dressing from her kit, working the bandage one-handed with the same flat efficiency she brought to everything else that day. And she did not report the wound on her next check-in, because a wounded corporal's voice on the radio does something to a platoon's morale, and morale, at this stage of a 9-hour hold, mattered as much as ammunition. She counted magazines after the assault broke, 5.5 remaining, roughly 170 rounds against what she now estimated was 5 hours. Still to hold, a tighter margin than she'd allowed herself that morning, but not yet a crisis, provided the enemy commander below her didn't commit to another full assault before probing again first. That was the bet every rearguard action eventually comes down to, not whether the defender can survive one assault, because almost any prepared position can survive one assault, but whether the defender can convince the attacker that a second assault will cost more than it's worth, again and again, for as many hours as it takes. The 5th hour brought 2 smaller probes rather than another full rush, each one testing a different section of the saddle's perimeter. And Calloway answered both with the same economy she'd used all day: single shots, staggered positions. Faintly, to shake with fatigue, by the time the sun crossed to the western half of the sky, she caught herself once, closing her eyes for what felt like half a second longer than a blink, and understood with total clarity that fatigue not enemy fire, was now the more dangerous threat standing between her and the 9th hour. At the start of the 6th hour, the enemy's forward observer, the glint of glass she'd spotted 3 hours earlier, finally found a firing angle on her eastern terrace position, and a burst of long-range fire chipped stone across the top of her parapet, close enough that she felt splinters sting her cheek, forcing her to abandon that position entirely and relocate under fire to the collapsed terrace wall below it. A scramble that cost her nearly 90 seconds of exposure, and very nearly cost her far more than that. It was the closest the day came to going wrong in a single irreversible way, and she knew it the moment she reached cover, her pulse hammering hard enough that she had to consciously slow her breathing before she could trust her hands on the rifle again. She adjusted immediately, abandoning the compromised eastern position for the rest of the hold, and consolidating her rotation between the 2 remaining points, which meant covering both approach lanes with fewer positions and less margin for error, a tightening of the plan that she communicated to no one, because there was no one to communicate it to. The decision, like every decision that day, was hers alone, made in real time, on ground she had spent 4 minutes studying that morning. She built one final decoy from what remained of her spare uniform items, positioning it at the compromised eastern point, specifically to draw the observer's continued attention there, a deliberate sacrifice of a known position. And it worked well enough that the enemy wasted a full magazine of long-range fire on an empty parapet 40 minutes later, while Calloway held silent and still on the western shoulder, letting them believe they'd found and suppressed a defender who was. The check-in at the 6-hour mark carried a different tone from Frost. The platoon had reached the base of the gorge trail and was now moving across more open ground toward the resupply road. Exposed terrain that, while faster to cross, offered less cover than the switchbacks had. And Frost's voice carried the specific tightness of a man doing his own arithmetic about how much longer his wounded soldiers could physically endure the pace before the relief column reached them. Calloway heard that tightness and understood exactly what it meant. However hard the last 6 hours had been on the saddle, the next 3 had to be harder, because both halves of this operation, her hold and their descent. The 7th hour brought the largest assault of the day, 12 fighters committing simultaneously across both lanes in a coordinated push that told Calloway the enemy commander had finally run out of patience with probing and decided to simply overwhelm whatever thin defense remained. She met it with everything the day had taught her, moving between her 2 remaining positions faster than she'd moved all morning, firing in bursts of 2 and 3 rounds, rather than single shots now, that concealment mattered less than raw suppression. Using her second grenade to break the momentum of the eastern element, just as it reached the narrowest point of the boulder field, the concussion and confusion buying her the 90 seconds she needed to reposition and meet the western element with the last of her spare magazine. It was by any honest accounting closer to a defeat than a victory in the moment it was happening. She was down to 2 magazines. By the time the assault finally broke, her hands were shaking from adrenaline and dehydration in roughly equal measure. And for perhaps the first time all day, she allowed herself to genuinely consider what happened if the enemy simply tried again, immediately, before she'd had even a minute to recover. But the assault did break, both elements pulling back down the slope in the ragged, ununiform way of a force that has just paid a price steeper than it expected. And in the radio traffic that followed, traffic Calloway didn't hear, but that reached the platoon through a different channel entirely. A battalion intelligence intercept that Frost relayed forward in fragments. It became clear that the enemy commander below the saddle had begun describing in his own transmissions a defended position that sounded in scale and coordination like a reinforced squad rather than the single corporal actually holding it. Corliss heard that intercept relayed over the platoon net, and something in his posture changed that the soldiers walking near him would describe afterward when they talked about that day at all. As the moment the lieutenant stopped being angry about being wrong, he didn't say anything on the radio. He simply picked up the pace of his own section of the litter line, put his shoulder harder into the work of moving wounded men across open ground toward a road that was, according to the last update from battalion, now less than 2 hours away for the relief column's lead element. The 8th hour opened with Calloway down to her final magazine and the spare rounds she'd stripped from 2 spent ones earlier in the day. A total she counted at 51 rounds, standing between her and whatever the enemy chose to do next, a number thin enough that she stopped thinking of it as ammunition, the way she had once been trained to think of a last magazine on a mountain 3 years and a lifetime ago as a message rather than a resource. Every round from here forward needed to say something specific to whoever was watching it land. Needed to convince them that spending more men on this saddle was not worth whatever they thought waited on the other side of it. She used the terrain the way she'd used it all day, but with a sharper, more economical precision now that she had no ammunition left to waste on anything less than a clear, confirmed target, letting a probing element close well past the range she'd have engaged at in the first hour. Waiting until she had a shot she was certain would land exactly where she wanted it, then firing once and moving immediately, never staying in a position long enough for the enemy to build any confidence about where she actually was. It was slower, more dangerous work than the free-flowing rhythm of the morning, and it demanded a kind of discipline that fatigue makes almost impossible to sustain, the discipline to wait when everything in an exhausted body wants to act. At the 8-hour 20-minute mark, she heard something that had not been part of the day until now, the distant, unmistakable thud of vehicles moving fast on a hard-packed road, still far off, still muffled by the terrain. She did not celebrate. She did not relax her rotation between positions or slow the careful economy of her last magazine because a relief column still 15 or 20 minutes out was still 15 or 20 minutes in which this saddle needed to look exactly as defended as it had looked for the previous 8 hours. And she had come too far, held too long, to let the last stretch be the stretch where the illusion finally cracked. The 9th hour was the hardest of the day, not because the enemy pressed harder, they didn't, their earlier losses having clearly convinced whoever commanded them that the cost of this ground had grown too steep to justify, but because holding discipline through 9 hours of accumulated fatigue, thirst and adrenaline crash, one that doesn't announce itself with gunfire and doesn't offer the clean, decisive moments that make holding easier. Calloway kept moving between her 2 positions on legs that had gone past, aching into something closer to numb. Kept her voice level on the half-hourly check-ins, even as her mouth had gone nearly too dry to form the words, cleanly, and kept her eyes on both approach lanes even as the accumulated hours pressed down on her, like a physical weight she had to consciously push against every single minute. The relief column's lead vehicles reached visual range of the gorge at 9 hours and 6 minutes past Calloway's first step onto the saddle. A convoy of armored trucks moving fast up the resupply road with a company-sized quick reaction force aboard, understanding with sudden clarity exactly how badly the calculus of this fight had just shifted against them, broke contact entirely, rather than risk being caught between the saddle they'd failed to take. Calloway saw the last of them withdraw down the far slope through her optic, confirmed it with a full 60 seconds of patient, disciplined observation before she allowed herself to believe it was real, and only then did she lower her rifle, sit down hard on the stone parapet of her final firing position, and let her hands, finally, shake without her forcing them still. The officer commanding the relief column's lead element was Captain Roscoe Bell, a broad-shouldered man with the unhurried, watchful manner of someone who had spent enough years in difficult places to have stopped being impressed by most things soldiers told him about themselves. He came up the last stretch of trail to the saddle on foot, ahead of his own soldiers, driven by a simple professional curiosity about who or what had held this ground, long enough for a full company to reach it without the wounded platoon below. losing another man to enemy fire on the descent. What he found at the crest was a single corporal, bandaged, forearm, dust-caked, uniform, sitting upright against a stone wall with an empty magazine still seated in her rifle, and a decoy in a torn uniform jacket propped 15 meters away. And it took him a long moment, standing there taking in the scene, to fully understand what he was looking at. He asked her name, and when she gave it, flat, tired, unadorned, Calloway, Rhea, Corporal, something shifted behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the 9 hours he'd just watched a relief column race to reach. Bell had served years earlier on a staff that had briefly handled classified after-action, reporting from a small number of advisory deployments that officially did not exist in any public record, and one name from one of those sealed reports had stayed with him the way certain names do, who had held a mountain choke point alone for the better part of a day so that an extraction element could get out with everyone alive. An operation with no medal ceremony, no public citation, nothing but a filing cabinet and a classification stamp to mark that it had ever happened. He had never expected to meet that name attached to a living, breathing person standing in front of him. He had certainly never expected to find her holding a saddle pass alone, for a second time, years later, in a different mountain range, for a platoon that had no idea what they'd actually been counting on to keep them alive. "You're the one from the sealed report," Bell said. And it wasn't a question, and Calloway looked at him for a long moment before she answered with the same flat honesty she'd offered all day. "I don't know what report you mean, sir," she said, which was true in the narrow technical sense that she had never been permitted to confirm its existence to anyone, and Bell, understanding exactly what that careful phrasing meant, because some things a professional soldier learns to recognize without needing them spoken aloud. What had actually held the saddle for 9 hours, moved through the relief column's ranks, the way word moves through any unit that has just watched something happen. It doesn't fully have language for yet. First as rumor, then as a series of soldiers quietly repositioning themselves near the crest to see for themselves, and finally, without anyone giving a specific order to do so, as a company of soldiers forming a loose line as Calloway rose from the stone parapet and began the walk down off the saddle toward the resupply road, where the rest of 3rd Platoon had finally, painfully, Captain Bell gave the order to present arms as she passed, a formal military courtesy that soldiers reserve, in practice, for moments that feel bigger than regulation strictly requires, and the company obeyed, without hesitation, rifles snapping up in unison. Her bandaged arms stiff at her side, her face showing nothing but the bone-deep exhaustion of 9 hours that had finally, actually ended. She did not know quite what to do with the gesture. She had spent 3 years learning to expect silence in exchange for the hardest things she'd ever done, and the sight of an entire unarmed line of strangers holding a salute for her walk down a mountain trail was, in its own quiet way, harder to absorb than the 9 hours that had earned it. First Lieutenant Sam Corliss was waiting at the bottom of the trail, and when Calloway reached him, he did not offer an apology in words. Some men never quite find the words for that, and Calloway had long since learned not to need them to. But he reached down and lifted her rucksack off the ground where she'd set it, swung it onto his own shoulders without being asked, and carried it the rest of the way down the mountain himself, a gesture that every soldier in that platoon understood exactly as it was meant, as the only apology a man like Corliss actually knew how to give. Offered in the only language that had ever mattered on that mountain, the language of carrying weight for someone who had just carried far more than her share of it. Doc Emery Tran met her a few steps further down, checking the field dressing on her forearm, with the same unhurried professionalism he'd shown every wounded soldier that day, murmuring something about how she'd wrapped it well enough that it hadn't needed touching in 9 hours, which was, from Tran, close to the highest compliment he offered anyone. Behind him, the 11 wounded soldiers lay in a loose row near the resupply road shoulder, some conscious enough to lift a hand toward her as she passed, others, too, far gone into shock or exhaustion, and every single one of them alive, because a corporal nobody had trusted with a fight had bought the exact number of hours their survival required. Staff Sergeant Frost found her last, after the immediate business of coordinating the medevac vehicles and briefing Bell's element on the platoon status had finally slowed enough for him to step away. And he didn't say much either. Frost was not a man of many words on his best day. And this had not been anyone's best day, but he stood beside her for a long moment, looking back up at the saddle they'd just descended from, and said the only thing that felt adequate to him. "I knew you could hold it," he said. "I just didn't know how bad I wanted to be right." Calloway managed something close to a smile, the first expression that had crossed her face in 9 hours that wasn't pure concentration, and told him that made 2 of them. In the weeks that followed, back at the forward operating base, Captain Bell filed a report of his own, unclassified this time, deliberately, publicly, a detailed account of a single corporal's 9-hour delaying action that used every term of art a military historian would recognize from the oldest doctrine in the profession: false strength, ammunition economy, the deliberate manufacture of doubt in an enemy commander's mind. He included, with her reluctant permission, a brief and carefully worded reference to the earlier operation that had shaped everything she'd done on that saddle, enough to explain the competence without exposing anything still legally sealed. And the report moved up through channels with a speed that surprised almost everyone who read it, because reports written in that particular tone of plain, specific, unembellished fact have a way of cutting through bureaucratic hesitation faster than reports written to impress. The advanced course that had rejected her application twice, quietly, without explanation, sent a 3rd invitation within the month, and this time nobody in the chain of command found a reason to lose the paperwork. Nobody made a ceremony of the reversal. Nobody needed to. Calloway read the notice standing in the same operations tent where, 6 months earlier, she had first been handed a stack of spare radio batteries and told, not unkindly but not respectfully either, that the platoon needed someone steady on the net. She read it, folded it once, and put it in the same pocket where she'd once carried the memory of a sealed report nobody was allowed to ask about, and for the first time in 3 years, that pocket held something she was actually permitted. Lieutenant Corliss changed in ways that showed up mostly in small, unannounced moments rather than any single dramatic reversal. He started routing terrain assessments through Calloway before finalizing platoon movement plans. Exactly what her read of ground was worth. He never again used the particular sentence that had followed him up that saddle, not because anyone forbade it, but because he had watched, in real time, over 9 of the longest hours of his young career, exactly how wrong that sentence had been, and some lessons land hard enough that a man doesn't need reminding twice. He did once, months later, ask her directly what had actually happened on the deployment behind that sealed report, in the kind of quiet off-duty moment where soldiers sometimes finally trust each other, enough to ask the questions regulation normally keeps them from asking. She told him what she was allowed to tell him, which was not much, and he did not push for more, understanding by then that some of the weight a soldier carries is not weight anyone else gets to help carry, no matter how much respect has grown between them since the day he doubted her. 6 weeks after the saddle, 3rd Platoon rotated into a new sector, and on the first morning of the new deployment, Staff Sergeant Frost walked over to Calloway with a spare radio battery in one hand, the same familiar handoff that had defined her role in this platoon. Quiet second. She wondered if anything had actually changed at all, but Frost didn't hand her the battery the way he used to, a task assigned to the soldier nobody quite trusted with anything sharper. He handed it to her the way a platoon sergeant hands equipment to the one soldier he trusts most completely to know exactly what to do with it, and the difference, subtle as it was not lost on either of them. She was still the one who carried the radios. She was still, on paper, a corporal in an infantry platoon with an unremarkable rank and an unremarkable job title. But nobody who had watched the relief column present arms as she walked off that mountain. Nobody who had heard Captain Bell's report move through the chain of command in a matter of weeks instead of years. And nobody who had personally felt the weight of a rucksack a lieutenant once carried down a switchback trail without being asked mistook that assignment for anything resembling a demotion anymore. It was, instead, exactly what it had always quietly been, even in the years before anyone else understood it. Proof that the steadiest hand in the platoon was the hand you wanted holding the line when everything else fell apart. Radio or rifle, chosen ground or last magazine. 9 hours or 9 minutes, it had never actually mattered which. It had only ever mattered that it was her hand. Some evenings, when the new sector was quiet, and the light went long and gold across whatever ridgeline the platoon happened to be camped beneath, Calloway would find herself looking up at high ground out of old habit. The same automatic assessment she'd made 1,000 times before the saddle, and would make 1,000 times after it, where the dead ground was, where the sight lines ran, where a single soldier with enough discipline and enough patience could hold an entire mountain if the math ever demanded it of her again. Nobody in the platoon needed to ask why she looked at terrain that way anymore. They already knew. And somewhere in a filing cabinet, 2 continents away, a second sealed report now sat beside the first, not identical, but written in the same plain, careful language, describing the same kind of soldier doing, in daylight this time, for a platoon that would never again make the mistake of underestimating her. If this story moved you, if you believe the ones who get doubted the loudest are so often the ones who end up holding the line the longest, hit like, subscribe, for more stories of the women who carried more than anyone gave them credit for, and drop a comment below. Or would you have walked up that saddle alone the way Rhea Calloway did? We read every comment, and we'll be back soon with another story of quiet strength proving loud doubt wrong.